Leif returned a sorrowful response, fearing that the savages were planning an attack that night. Knowing their tactics, he gathered a team of skilled men to quietly venture into the forest and collect pine cones and birch bark, both highly flammable, to bring back to the fort. If they were attacked, they were to fight back and retreat towards the ramparts where their fellow Norsemen would cover them. While they were on their mission, another team was sent to retrieve a long log and several old planks from the nearby lake. Using their axes and quick hands, they erected a platform atop the log that could be ascended using pegs driven into the wood. Pine cones and birch bark were piled onto the platform, ready to be ignited. Leif instructed the men to rest, prepared for a surprise attack. He would take the role of sentinel, and when the time was right, they would launch a surprise attack of their own. Only a select few were informed of the plan in detail before they lay down for the night. Leaving his lieutenant to guard the walls, Leif slipped into the shed where the women huddled. "Stay under cover, Gunhildr," he warned, "for our foes may rain arrows down upon us, or worse, but we'll be ready." "Are there many attackers?" asked Gunhildr, fear rippling through her voice. "So they say," replied Leif, a confident glint in his eye, "but walls such as these will serve us well." "I'd love to wrap my fingers in their chieftain's hair," muttered Fridtja through gritted teeth. "I share your sentiment," laughed Leif. "If only you were a man, Fridtja. With your spirit you'd be an asset in battle." Bergunnar, seating herself on a box beside Astrid, slid an arm around her waist. "I'm grateful there are other fields where women can contribute," she said. Fridtja simply shot the handmaid a scornful glance. She knew this wasn't the moment for her particular talents. Leif assured the women that all was well before leaving the shed. "You have nothing to fear," he said. "We fear nothing," Fridtja declared on behalf of the group. Some sisters might have joked that she spoke for herself, but none dared contradict her. Fear of the impending danger permeated the air. Leif rejoined Hengler on the walls just as night descended on the forest. He suggested his lieutenant rest, but Hengler insisted on keeping watch alongside him. With no moon, the night was as black as pitch, ideal for the natives' intentions. Leif stood rigid, leaning on his spear, while Hengler perched on the rampart. Both strained their eyes and ears for any sign of the foe. At last, Leif nudged Hengler and gestured towards a moving shape in the clearing that separated their hamlet from the forest. "Wake the men," he whispered, "quiet as wolves, and not a peep from anyone." Hengler didn't respond. He skulked off without a sound. One by one the men assembled, their movements light and cat-like, taking their positions, each beside a pile of rocks and a bundle of arrows laid on the wall. Below them, a bowman aimed his arrow through each slit. Then an ear-shattering roar erupted from the darkness, a cry so savage and unearthly that even the Vikings flinched. The sound echoed again and again before they heard a thundering rush, and barely glimpsed dark shapes vaulting over the low barrier of felled trees that girded their village. The savages howled and screamed as they surrounded the houses, smashing the doors and barging in, but they quickly retreated, their cries now replaced with surprised exclaims as they groped through the darkness, searching for their hidden enemies. It didn't take long for them to storm the rock fortress, their war cries echoing as they amassed in the hundreds. But with no sight or sound of their expected foe, they fell silent, sensing that something mysterious was afoot. Still, they scaled the rock and felt around the bottom of the wooden palisades for a way in. That's when Leif gave a predetermined signal. One of his men lit a pile of bark and fir cones, and a brilliant blaze exploded upwards as Leif growled, "Up, lads!" in a deep, stern tone. A volley of large stones rained down on the savages' skulls, and they tumbled down the steep sides of the mound, shrieking and crying in terror this time. From every direction, more of the savages converged on the fortress. Simultaneously the flames spiked as if with a life of their own, bathing the entire scene in daylight. From every loophole and parapet in the fortress, a hail of arrows shot out, piercing through the night air and landing amongst the savage horde. Their shafts either fell harmlessly from the helmets and shields of the Norsemen, or quivered weakly in the palisade. Even in this moment of grave danger, Leif's desire to spare lives shone through. He ordered his men to only wound the savages, if possible, by drawing their bows just slightly and aiming for their legs. Consequently, many of the wounded warriors howled in agony as they fled, filling the woods with their cries. Nonetheless, a valiant sortie from the fortress and a deep-throated war cry from the Norsemen pushed the savages into a full retreat, back to their jungle territory. It's worth noting that there wasn't as much danger in this sally as modern folk might imagine. Even if the savages hadn't fled, these Norsemen, with their bulky forms, sweeping swords, immense shields and defensive armour, could have cut their way out from amongst hundreds of such half-naked foes. Of course, Leif had anticipated the savages would flee, and therefore had no intention of immediately returning to the fort. He only went to the outer wall, and with half of his men he boomed out a roaring din, hurrying the retreating enemy along. The other half of his men scurried around, scooping up every arrow they could spot. Leif was pleased to hear upon his return to the fort that only 2 dead bodies had been found on the battlefield. The savages had not given up the fight, and their presence was felt in the deafening noise they made in the woods. Leif ordered the fire to be extinguished, because the light might give away their position, and the savages could launch a surprise attack with their arrows. The night was long and restless, and the Norsemen could not let their guard down. As the first light of dawn appeared, a terrible realization dawned on the beleaguered Norsemen. The savages had piled up an enormous amount of timber nearby, and from there they could attack with their arrows. They were adding logs to the pile, and it was growing higher by the minute. Hengler's anxiety was palpable as he exclaimed, "They mean to burn us out." But one of the men observed, "Rather to smoke us out. Fire can never reach us from that distance." Leif's mood was grave as he gazed at the pile of wood growing steadily. "If they make the pile big enough," he said, "it may reach us well enough. They have plenty of hands and no lack of wood." He pointed to the direction of the wind and added, "See, they are piling it to windward. God grant that the breeze may not increase, else shall we have to forsake the fortress. Nevertheless, our good ship is at hand, and they will find us tough to deal with when we get upon the water. Come, lads, we will at all events harass if we cannot stop them." Leif ordered his men to fire a constant stream of arrows whenever they saw the savages. He himself led a sally and struck the savages back to the woods, but as soon as the Norsemen returned to the fortress, the savages came out again and resumed their work. The morning passed in a brutal stalemate, and the Norsemen realized that they were fighting a losing battle. Despite the arrows and sallies of the Norsemen, the pile of wood for the intended bonfire was steadily growing higher. They were running out of time and options, and their fate hung in the balance. Chapter 22. Hafgrimr makes a bold venture but does not win. The Norsemen find that there is many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. After Kjartan and his men had successfully navigated the rough waters, they continued their journey toward the native village. As nomads, the natives only carried temporary shelters made of poles and leather coverings, which they set up in different areas depending on their needs. The tribe that had captured the Norse children had just arrived in the area and was unaware of the white strangers. While leading the way in his canoe, Kjartan's group suddenly noticed the smoke from the natives' fires rising above the treetops, causing them to halt their progress. Krumar, the first to spot the smoke, whispered urgently to them about the possible danger. Thorkel suggested attacking the natives immediately, but Kjartan, a cautious man, suggested that they cross the river and climb the nearby height for a better view and to plan their attack. After safely crossing the river, they hid their canoes and made their way through the forest to the cliff, which overlooked the native encampment. To their surprise and dismay, they discovered that the encampment was enormous, housing hundreds of men, women, and children. The 2 leaders lay prone on their bellies, their heads barely peering above the tall grass. Their men stayed back in the shadows, their hushed chatter not daring to disrupt the leaders' discussions. "This is an unfortunate business," Kjartan muttered, his brow furrowed with concern. "Truly it is," Thorkel nodded in agreement. "But the question is, are these the same scoundrels who took the children? They seem too small a band to be part of the larger group we know about." "That may be true, Thorkel," Kjartan admitted, "but I have a feeling that these are the same ones, perhaps a splinter group from the larger one." As if to confirm their suspicions, Olaf and Snorro emerged from the woods across the river. The Norsemen leaders recognized the children immediately and struggled to contain their excitement. "Thank God for the sight of them," Kjartan sighed in relief, watching Olaf play with Snorro on the sandy shore. "They look unharmed, at least." "It would be even better if Olaf had a hold of the father's hand right now," Thorkel grumbled dryly. "It's not that easy," Kjartan countered, shaking his head. "We can't just mount an open attack with so few men against hundreds of savages." "I wouldn't advise that either," Thorkel conceded. "But what do you propose?" "We need to have a strategy," Kjartan said thoughtfully. "I'll call Hafgrimr to join us. He's a clever thinker and might have an idea." As Hafgrimr joined the 2 leaders, he took in the scene below them, studying the movements of the natives in the bay. "Could we not take our canoes and make a quick dash at the sand spit to snatch the children?" Thorkel suggested. "They would see us coming and be ready for us," Kjartan pointed out. "We're outnumbered and outmatched." "I have a plan," Halfgrimr said quietly, looking up at the others. "But you might think it foolish." "Tell us," Kjartan urged, willing to consider anything at this point. And so the three strategized, each contributing their ideas and opinions, piecing together a plan that just might work. But only time would tell if they could outwit the savages and retrieve the missing children. Halfgrimr spoke up. "If you all agree, I'll cross the river alone and unarmed. I'll walk straight to where the children are sitting. There will be shrubs for much of the way, and I may not be noticed until I'm close. If I'm seen, I'll make a dash for the children, scoop them up, head to the rapids and jump in. Once I reach the opposite bank, I'll run to meet you all, and we'll hasten to the canoes. If we have to fight our way there, we will. We'll sweep down the river, and if we get a fair start, we'll make it to Leif's guard before they catch us. If not, then I'll improvise." Thorkel chuckled. "A rare plan. But what if you are seen and caught before getting the children?" Halfgrimr replied, "I'll improvise. It may be an advantage to be held captive with the children. At most, it's just one man lost." Kjartan added, "It would be a great loss, but the plan seems likely. My main concern is your speed with the weight of the children." Halfgrimr replied calmly, "I can carry Ogmundren on my back and Snorro under my left arm. My right arm will be free to swing. Speed won't be an issue." Thorkel asked skeptically, "What about crossing the river? Won't the weight of your wet clothes slow you down and give away your location?" Halfgrimr replied, "No, I'll tie my clothes in a tight bundle on top of my head. I've crossed many streams in my native land like this." Thorkel couldn't come up with a better plan and reluctantly agreed. Halfgrimr got ready and his brother led the men back to the canoes to hide. Kjartan stayed behind to watch the outcome. Halfgrimr was nervous, but he felt that this was his only chance. If they attempted an open attack, they would fail against the daunting odds. The young man descended to the river with a light step, his thoughts on Bergunnar. He crossed the river with a bundle on his head, unnoticed by the watchers on the cliff. He quickly put on his light garments and disappeared into the bushes, moving swiftly like a panther towards his prey. When he reached the last point of concealment, he assumed a careless air and walked towards the spit of land where Ogmundrand and Snorro were playing. Thorkel watched with admiration as Halfgrimr bravely and cleverly approached the children. He would have succeeded in his mission had Ogmundr not noticed him while he was still 50 yards away. Ogmundr shouted with joy and ran to meet him, but Halfgrimr dashed past him and caught up to Snorro, urging him to rise and flee for his life. Ogmundr understood the danger and leaped onto Halfgrimr's back as he fled at a pace that defied the pursuit of the savages who were hot on their heels. The Scot was well on his way to the rapid, and his pursuers were far behind, but a group of over a dozen natives who happened to be ascending the river's bank met the fugitive. Halfgrimr stopped abruptly and considered his options. He turned to the river, but a canoe with 4 savages in it shot out from the bank just below him, making escape impossible. Halfgrimr set the children on the ground and surrendered himself quietly to the natives. Thorkel and Kjartan were filled with fury and disappointment, having failed right on the cusp of success. Thorkel drew his sword and vented his frustration by hacking down 2 small trees with a single stroke before rushing towards the canoes. Kjartan followed, equally furious at the missed opportunity. Fortunately, Hervor was ready for their return and had the canoes manned and ready to go. Kjartan urged his men to push off, and they shot out of the bank with such force that the foam curled from their bows and left a long white track behind them as they rushed up the river and swept out onto the broad expanse above. They had been spotted before they reached that point, and immediately the savages armed themselves and took positions on the banks. However, they did not go to the spit of sand where Ogmundrand Snorro had first been seen by their allies. That spot was located so high up the stream that it seemed to be ignored by everyone. Kjartan noticed this immediately and made his plans accordingly. He advanced as though he intended to land below the spit, but made no hostile gestures and silently paddled toward the shore. The savages, prepared with their arrows, did not seem to understand him and remained passive. When they were a short distance from the land, Kjartan suddenly but quietly turned the canoe upstream and headed for the spit of sand. The other canoes followed suit. Upon seeing the intentions of the strangers, the natives let out a wild cry and rushed to the same location along the shore. However, before they could reach it, Kjartan had landed with all his men, and with their imposing figures and peculiar arms, they presented a formidable front, causing the natives to stop dead in their tracks. At this point, the crowd parted slightly to let someone pass, and Whitepow emerged. Believing him to be the leader, Kjartan immediately laid down his sword and stepped forward a few paces in front of his men, holding up his hands and making peaceful gestures. But Whitepow wasn't feeling peaceful. Although advanced in age, he was a strong man who stood tall and carried a large club on his shoulder. In response to the Norseman's overtures, he scowled fiercely and shook his head violently, indicating that he was far too experienced to be taken in by such nonsense. He then turned to those around him and issued a command that led to Halfgrimr being brought forward with his arms bound tightly to his sides. Kjartan thought to himself, "If only you had brought the children to this spot, I would do anything to rescue them." However, it wasn't wise to make a desperate attempt to save Halfgrimr while the children were still hidden and at the mercy of the savages. Therefore, Kjartan put on his most genial expression and manner and once more tried to gain Whitepow's trust. However, Whitepow shook his head again, pointing back toward the two children and then at Halfgrimr before hurling his club with great force and accuracy at Kjartan's head. The stout Norseman would surely have been knocked flat if he hadn't been extremely alert and blocked the club with his shield, causing it to clang loudly before hissing into the river. Kjartan smiled as if he found the incident amusing, and even took a few steps forward, holding up his hands, while the crowd of savages exclaimed in surprise. It was likely that Whitepow was a hero whose weapon had always resulted in certain death for his foes. The failure of his club seemed to infuriate the old savage beyond his limits, and he immediately grabbed a bow and shot an arrow at the Norseman leader. The shot was well aimed, but the arrow shattered upon Kjartan's shield and fell to the ground. As the Norsemen stood on the spit of sand, they watched as their chief, Whitepow, ordered his warriors to remove Halfgrimr and fall back a little. Kjartan, anticipating the aggression of the Norsemen, turned about and directed them to hold their fire. The movement puzzled Kjartan, who rejoined his men. Thorkel advised that they should begin the fight immediately, but Kjartan did not agree. He reminded them that if by chance they failed, every man of them would die, and their colony would be left weak, with little chance of surviving. Besides, the children would be lost forever. Kjartan suggested waiting a little longer to see if the white-haired old savage would have a change of heart. Thorkel frowned at Kjartan's suggestion and pointed to a bend in the river. Around the bend, 100 canoes swept towards them. Kjartan's countenance fell, and he muttered sadly, "All is lost. Oh, my tender little child." However, he quickly regained his composure and arranged his men in a circle, presenting a front in all directions. Taking his stand on the landward side of his men, Kjartan calmly awaited the onset. It seemed as if a fierce and bloody battle was about to begin, as the savages moved steadily down towards the spit of sand. However, a sudden and loud shout was heard down the river, causing all eyes to turn in that direction. Several canoes were seen coming around the bend of the river, full of armed men. The descent of the native fleet was checked, and the Norsemen knew their comrades had arrived. They greeted their approach with a lusty cheer, and in another minute had leaped upon the sand. "Welcome, welcome, Bolverk!" Thorkel exclaimed with great delight, seizing and wringing his friend's hand. "Why, we thought we had said our farewells, but I see we'll have another tale to tell now." "May God bless you for arriving at such an opportune time, Bolverk," Kjartan added. "Please have your men join us and extend the circle. Yes, wider, that will do. For now we'll spare you the questioning as to what brought you here. We have more pressing matters at hand." The leader busied himself with arranging his reinforcements while the savages held back, waiting for the result of a consultation between Whitepow W and the tribe's chief men. Chapter 23. Difficulties regarding intercommunication, the power of finery displayed, also the power of song and sentiment. The Norsemen were invigorated by the arrival of the Norsemen reinforcements. They now numbered over 50 strong and well-armed men, capable of holding their own against any army no matter how big. However, they were still facing over 1,000 savages, each of whom was skilled in guerrilla tactics. The savages could move rapidly from tree to tree, harassing and picking off their enemies one by one, whereas the Norsemen were more comfortable fighting in open fields. Kjartan was aware of this, but he didn't wish to dampen the spirits of his fellows. The savages on the shore began to stir, and it was clear that they were getting ready to attack. The Norsemen saw that another fleet of canoes was approaching the shore from above. The savages on land also began to move towards the spit of sand. Bolverk voiced his suspicion that the savages were planning an attack on all sides. Thorkel was ready to face the enemy head-on, even if it meant facing death itself. The determined and fierce stance of the Norsemen showed that they were ready to fight. Suddenly there was a shout from the woods, and a lone savage appeared. He was running and approached the white-haired chief with great fervour and gesticulations. Although the Norsemen were too far away to hear him or see his countenance, it was clear that he was bringing news. Kjartan doubted that the news would be in their favour. Thorkel recognized the savage and called him Otwe. He had already been injured in a previous encounter with the Norsemen. The savage appeared slightly deranged, taking an arrow and going through the motions of firing it before pretending to take an injury himself. He then knelt, as if comforting a wounded man before going on to perform more strange pantomimic acts. Thorkel and Bolverk realized that it was Otwe who had been helped by Bergener in the previous encounter. "Without a doubt," exclaimed Kjartan, his voice laced with optimism, "he must be pleading our case for peace. What else could he be doing?" Thorkel, however, interjected with a hint of uncertainty. "I'm not so sure. He could just as likely be persuading them to kill us and take control of Leifsgard." Bolverk quickly pointed out that the looming question would soon be answered, as the savage was approaching them. After exchanging words with White Pow, Otwe fearlessly ran towards the Norseman. Kjartan volunteered to greet him, despite Bolverk's warning of potential danger. "Confidence begets confidence," Kjartan declared, discarding his sword and shield and approaching Otwe unarmed. Their handshake, a gesture Otwe had learned while recuperating in Leifsgard, served as their common language. With powerful gesticulations, Otwe motioned towards Kjartan's heart, and then to the old chief, indicating a sign of respect. Kjartan led the towering savage through the crowd of native chiefs and bowed before White Pow, who exclaimed, "Ho!" in solemn satisfaction. Kjartan then communicated with a series of hand gestures while the natives watched in rapt fascination. White Pow and Otwe responded in turn with energetic demonstrations that Kjartan could not fully comprehend. Nonetheless, the result of it all was clear. Otwe proposed that the Norsemen unite with the savages and become lifelong friends. Kjartan, however, firmly rejected the proposal and shook his head vehemently. He stooped and indicated something approximately 2 feet high and caressed the imaginary object tenderly. He then pointed to something higher and repeated the gesture. Finally, he acted as though he were bound and unable to move, struggling to be free until he could brandish an imaginary knife and cut himself loose. The natives appeared to comprehend Kjartan's peculiar gestures and responded with enthusiasm, exclaiming, "Ho!" repeatedly. However, White Pow vetoed the proposal, shaking his head and remaining resolute. Kjartan, resigned, crossed his arms over his chest and scowled at the ground. The tense situation had reached an uncomfortable stalemate when Kjartan noticed a flash of bright scarlet cloth attached to his neck, courtesy of Gunhilder's embellishment before his departure, a gesture comparable to the chivalrous age of a young wife tying a scarf to her knight's arm preceding an imminent war. A sudden idea struck Kjartan as he unfastened and advanced to White Pow, proffering the piece of cloth with a congenial smile. The old chief was smitten upon setting eyes on the brilliant cloth and expressed immense admiration upon receiving it, behaving much like a child in his appreciation for such fineries that he was unable to contain his emotions. Noticing the good effect produced, Kjartan emphasized having ample provisions of similar articles and even drew several small metal ornaments from his pouch before revealing his precious silver brooch that hung delicately beneath his leather war-shirt around his neck. The heirloom had been carried to Iceland by his forefathers after being banished from Norway by King Harald Fairhair and possessed considerable value to Kjartan. Naturally, White Pow's gaze landed upon the alluring silver brooch, expressing an ardent desire to acquire it. Kjartan suddenly feigned alarm, held the brooch aloft and stared at it in profound veneration before clutching it tightly to his chest and shaking his head vehemently in refusal. This only doubled White Pow's interest in the heirloom, to which Kjartan stooped low and marked the ground with his hand 2 feet away from him. He stated that White Pow may have the brooch for that specific distance along with other articles mentioned earlier. After a few minutes of contemplation, White Pow gestured for 2 of his chiefs to depart the gathering. They led back Halfgrimr and the children after a brief while, still tied up. The sight of their father was a surprise for Olaf, whose astonishment was outdone by Snorro's screams of delight upon recognizing his father. Ogmundr immediately seized Snorro and ran towards him. Kjartan met the children halfway, expressing overwhelming gratitude as he clutched Snorro to his chest while Ogmundr tightly hung on to his leg. However, he realized the circumstances and set Snorro down before retrieving the silver brooch and placing it in White Pow's hand while pointing towards Halfgrimar's bonds. Understanding Kjartan's intentions, the old chief drew his knife and cut the bonds, freeing Halfgrimar. "Take your time, Halfgrimar," spoke the leader. "Hold Snorro in your arms and Ogmundar's hand. Walk slowly but steadily towards our comrades. If anyone tries to stop you, do not resist. Turn around and come back to me." Halfgrimar obeyed without question and made his way towards his fellow Norsemen. Meanwhile, Kjartan was overwhelmed with joy. He removed all the ornaments he had on him and presented them to White Pow, even including the last trinket at the bottom of his wallet. He tried to convey to the old man that all his men had similar offerings to donate if the majority of his people were ordered to retreat a distance away, only retaining a group equal in number to the Norsemen. Initially, the chief seemed hesitant, but Utwe's persuasive speech won him over. The old man rose, bellowed an order in a commanding voice, and gestured with his hand. Suddenly the entire crowd backed away, leaving only a select few of the principal men near their leader. Halfgrimar sprinted towards Utwe, not only excited to help his savior, but also happy to be free again. "Go back, Halfgrimar," Kjartan ordered. "Tell the others to come quietly in a compact group, leaving their bows and spears behind and only carrying their swords and shields. Leave a strong guard with the weapons and children. Make sure Bolverk and Thorkel stay with them. Put the children in a canoe, and you and Hervor get ready to man it." "That has already been done," replied Halfgrimar. "By whose orders?" Kjartan questioned. "At my suggestion," Halfgrimar answered. "You are a wise man, Halfgrimar. Thank you. Now go. 2 canoes should accompany you in case of a water attack, or if a quick escape is necessary while we guard the retreat." "That has already been arranged," said Halfgrimar. "Good, good. Then no matter what happens to us, the children will likely be safe. Go now, Halfgrimar, and if we do not return, please give my love to Gunhildr. Go." Halfgrimar bowed and departed. Within a few minutes, most of the Norsemen were standing before the chief. By Kjartan's command, anyone who had any decorations on them offered them to the savages. In return, White Pow instructed for a bundle of furs to be brought out and distributed them amongst the Norsemen. Kjartan then had Utwe explain that he had seen valuable cloth and ornaments in the Norsemen's camp. In exchange for furs, they could have them. The savages were pleased to hear this news, since they possessed an abundance of furs, which were of minimal value to them. Amicable relations was established between the Norsemen and the savages. White Pow had invited the Norsemen to his village for a feast, but Kjartan had different plans. He intended to sup and pass the night on the spit of sand and return to his home in the morning. He hoped that the savages would follow him home with their furs. Kjartan suggested that a small number might accompany him if they wanted to see his habitation and take back a report. The savages agreed, and the conferences were concluded happily. That night, the Norsemen held a boisterous carousal on the spit of sand, partly because they were happy about the successful expedition, and partly because they wanted to show a free and easy attitude to the savages. The Norsemen drew a line at the narrowest part of the neck of land and posted armed sentinels, who steadfastly refused to let anyone pass. Other sentinels were placed on the outward edge of the spit, who deterred any approach by water. Occasionally, when some obstinate natives tried to force a landing, the sentinels overturned their canoes, and the occupants had to swim ashore. The exception to this rule was 3 visitors, Utwe, White Pow, and his grandson, Little Powlet. They came to the spit after the Norsemen had kindled a magnificent bonfire of dry logs. The Norsemen sat around it and ate their supper, told sagas, sang songs, cracked jokes, and drank to absent friends in cans of pure water. Their merriment raised a new idea in the savage minds, filling them with indescribable amazement. The entire population sat on the surrounding banks and heights nearly the whole night, listening and gazing in silent admiration at the proceedings of the Norsemen, like a vast audience witnessing the entertainments of an amphitheatre. The Norsemen extended their utmost hospitality to their 3 visitors, who partook of the food set before them with much relish. Fortunately, some of the men who were left to guard the arms still possessed some trinkets and pieces of bright cloth. Kjartan was able to gratify his new friends with a few more presents. "Snorro," said Kjartan, who sat beside White Pow in front of the fire with the child on his knee, "are you glad to see your father again?" "I is," said Snorro, responding slightly to the tender embrace that he received. Snorro had not quite reached the age of reciprocal attachment, at least with men. He loved whoever fed him best. However, in Snorro's eyes, Ogmundr was an exception to the rule. If Ogmundr had starved and beaten him during the first half of a day, by way of experiment, Snorro would have clung to him and loved him throughout the other half. "Come here, Olaf," Kjartan said, handing him a small cloth. "Give this to the lad." He pointed to Powlett. "He's quite taken with Snorro and deserves a little something." Olaf chuckled, taking the cloth and following Kjartan's orders. Returning to Snorro's side, he remarked, "Taken with him. You should have seen the day he painted my face. Snorro had never laughed so hard." Ogmundr then regaled the group with the story of the painting operation, his humour so contagious that the Norsemen threw back their heads in uproarious laughter, causing the cliffs to reverberate with the sound. With the mood lightened, Krumer told a story and sang a rollicking tune, and of course Halfgrimr was called upon to sing, which he did, his native song so moving that the normally stoic savages couldn't help but let out an admiring murmur. As soon as the old chieftain and his companions left, the sentries were doubled and the fire extinguished. Each Norseman placed a hand on his sword hilt and shielded himself as they prepared for the night's rest. The horde of savages retreated to their own shelters. Chapter 24. The burning on the fortress a threatened fight ends in a feast which leads to friendship, happy reunion, and proposed desertion. The next morning, the Norsemen rose early and were eager to start their journey. However, to their surprise, their party was larger than they had expected, as more locals had joined them. Kjartan didn't object to this unexpected addition, as he could feel the goodwill of the natives towards him and trusted that they had no ill intentions. They leisurely made their way down the stream, camping out at night, enjoying the summer weather, and chatting by the campfires. Little did Kjartan know the urgency of the situation his friends at Leifsgard were in, as they were facing dire circumstances. If Leif had only known that his friends were on their way back, he might have held the fortress for longer by continuing his desperate sallies to prevent the rising pile from burning them. Unfortunately, he was unaware of their return, and the constant vigilance and sallies were wearing his men out. So he decided that they would abandon the castle and take to the ship instead. In the darkest hour of the night, they managed to move everything portable and board the Snake with all the women and men without the savages noticing. They fortified the vessel as best they could, and hung their shields around the bulwarks. The savages had decided to set fire to their pile of timber on the very night that Leif and his crew boarded their ship. The pile had grown to such a height that it was almost equal to the fortress it was meant to consume. At dawn, the torch was applied, and Kjartan, along with his men and their savage companions, left the campsite from the previous night and launched their canoes. The leader of the fleet had purposely camped near the settlement, preferring to arrive in the morning with such a large and unexpected party. The Norsemen were surprised when they saw a dense cloud of smoke rising in the far distance soon after starting their journey. Their anxiety grew as they observed the cloud spreading and floating exactly over the place where the settlement was located. Kjartan shouted for the men to push on, and they paddled with such force and fury that their canoes almost leapt out of the river as well as over it. As the sun rose in all its glory, its warm rays illuminated the scene below. The mighty flames of the bonfire that had been lit by the savages rose high, reaching out to nearby trees and licking them up like they were mere stubble. The heat was almost too intense to bear, and before long the wooden fortress was engulfed in flames, much to the delight of the savages, who let out a yell of triumph that sent shivers down the spines of those approaching. Even the little band that lay undiscovered on board the Snake was overawed. But as the savages soon realized, the fortress was empty. A cry of fury followed the initial shout of triumph, prompting the whole band to suspect that their enemies had fled to their vessel. They rushed to the shores of the lake, only to be met by the Norsemen, who were ready to give them a fight. Kjartan and his men appeared from round the point above the bay, cheering loudly, and followed by a stream of the canoes of their savage allies, whom they had outstripped in their haste. Kjartan wasted no time trying to ascertain what had happened. He was content just to see that his comrades and the women were safe on board the Snake. He ran the canoes high and dry on the beach, leaped ashore, and quickly drew his men up into a line. With a wild shout, they charged upon the savages, who, taken by surprise, did not wait for the onslaught. With a hideous yell, they turned and fled like autumn leaves before the wind. Returning to the friendly savages, who had looked on in surprise and concern, Kjartan wore a stern expression. He pointed towards the woods in which his enemies had vanished, shook his fist, and tried using signs to indicate his displeasure, while also urging the friendly savages to intervene and bring about peaceful relations. The natives understood him perfectly and were quick to act. A party of them immediately headed off to the woods, while Kjartan returned to the Snake. There he found Leif and his friends delighted to see him, and the women in a state of wild elation, almost devouring Ogmundr and Snorro, who had been sent to the vessel when the men landed to attack the savages. "It's so good to see your sweet face, Gunnhildr," he said, giving his wife a hearty kiss, "and I'm quite sure that Snorro agrees with me on that." He does," cried Gunnhildr, hugging the child tightly, who clung to her neck with a tenacity that he had never before exhibited. He had learned that absence truly makes the heart grow fonder. "Oh, I am so happy and so thankful. My sweet bairn Snorro. Where did you find him? How did you rescue him? I felt sure you would do it. How did he look when he saw you and—" "Hold, Gunnhildr," cried Kjartan, laughing. "Joy has upset thy judgment. I can answer but one question at a time." Gunnhildr stood speechless, her attention on Snorro and Olaf, who were now receiving her adoring embraces and affectionate inquiries. Bergunnar, Astrid, and Thorgunnar all joined in, overwhelming the two boys with attention. Even Frigja, who was typically unyielding, softened and passionately kissed Ogmundr and Snorro multiple times before showing remarkable kindness to Thorkel. Leif and his comrades retreated to the stern for a brief conference. "You arrived just in time," said Leif. "It seems so," replied Bolverk, "but it was more chance than strategy, for I left you with limited help. If it hadn't been for our fortunate arrival, there would have been trouble. A higher power than luck guided us here," added Kjartan. "That's true," nodded Leif seriously. "Of course," agreed Bolverk. "The same power led me to come with reinforcements for you. My advice now is that we quickly make the huts defensible." "That's what I think too," replied Kjartan. "The friendly locals could easily become hostile, and it might be easier to make our enemies into allies. What do you think, Leif?" "We should go ashore and follow Bolverk's suggestion without delay," answered Leif. "What if the enemy attacks in overwhelming numbers and forces us to retreat?" questioned Thorkel. "You must be timid to suggest such a thing," rebuked Bolverk. "Okay, assuming that I am timid," said Thorkel. "What do we do if we're driven into the lake?" "We'll have to accept defeat and drown like Frigja's cat," snapped Bolverk. "Not entirely," interjected Leif with a grin. "We can at least leave our bones behind on land to mix with those of all the savages we kill." "That won't be much of a comfort to the women if they are taken by the savages," Thorkel replied sarcastically. "I see what you're getting at," understood Kjartan. "We should have the Snake ready as a fallback option if we are defeated. But honestly, the idea of losing to these pitiful savages never crossed my mind. Considering the thickness of your skull, that's not surprising," jested Thorkel. Everyone chuckled, and Kjartan asked Thorkel for his advice. "Listen up," he said with authority. "I suggest not only preparing the Snake for a long voyage, but also readying my ship, which luckily happens to be here, for departure. We don't need to pack up our belongings just yet. In case of danger, we can fend off any savages with the help of Bolverk, who will defend us even if it means sacrificing himself. However, to ensure the safety of our women and children, I suggest they stay on board the ships until further notice." Frigja, who had joined the group at that moment, interjected, "I suggest we get moving instead of just talking about it. If we waste any more time, the women and children might feel compelled to lead the way themselves." The group chuckled at her remark, and the four chiefs got to work, planning and organizing. Meanwhile, a large crowd of natives gathered on the nearby hills, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. After much discussion, a group split from the larger gathering and headed towards the hamlet. The Norsemen, prepared and alert, manned their defences and waited for the newcomers. "I think they come in peace," Kjartan remarked as they approached. "They appear unarmed. Hafgrimr, what do your sharp eyes tell you?" "They are indeed unarmed," Hafgrimr replied. Upon getting closer to the defences, the natives gestured with their hands to show their peaceful intentions. Seeing an opportunity for friendship, Kjartan chose a group of his most robust men, and, having disarmed them, went out to meet the newcomers. After much gesticulation and signalling, both sides formed an alliance and made plans for a festive feast, a grand picnic of sorts, where both parties would supply food and leave behind their weapons. Such agreements were not easy to come by without the use of words, but Krumr proved himself to be a master of sign language, communicating with the natives through gestures and sounds that defied description. In the end, both sides agreed to enter into a new and happy bond of friendship. At the feast, a staggering amount of venison and salmon was consumed. Countless speeches were made by members of both parties, each side thunderously approving of their own speakers, while focusing with rapt attention on the speeches of their opponents, as if every word mattered. Two events of particular significance occurred during the feast, which must not be glossed over. First, in the middle of the feast, an unexpected arrival shook things up. The venerable chief White Pow, his grandson Powlet, and several of his principal men, including Otway, arrived in a canoe. Both groups greeted them with ecstatic excitement, for their arrival formed a new bond of union between them. For security purposes, it had been organized by Kjartan that the savages and Norsemen were to be seated separately and not to mix. However, White Pow, either uninformed or uncaring about the protocol, promptly crossed over to the Norsemen and went through the practice of shaking hands with all and sundry. Powlet and Otway followed his lead, doing the same. Then they settled down, and Otway made an impassioned speech in favor of peace, communicating fervently through pantomime the good treatment he'd received from the Norsemen in the past. Powlet aided the cause of peace without realizing it by showering Olaf with many different kinds of expressions of goodwill and joy at seeing him again. He also shouted Snorro's name several times, but unfortunately Olaf could only shake his head and point to the hamlet where Snorro and the women were under the watch of a strong and trustworthy guard. After the feast concluded, a group of savages grew particularly eager and fervent in their attempts to communicate something to their new friends. For a long time, even the most graphic and energetic signs failed to make them understand. Leif couldn't help but laugh as Crummer, the puzzled interpreter, shook his head for the 5th time at an energetic young savage with a red spot on his chin and a blue stripe on his nose who had been gesticulating, or more like agonizing, before him for some time. "I'm afraid you've eaten too much or ruined your powers of interpretation by some other means, Crummer," said Leif. "I can't make it out at all," replied Crummer. "Try again, Blue Nose," he said, turning with determination to the savage, whose frantic movements were making him sweat with the effort of comprehension. "Move your limbs and contort your face a little more aggressively. I'll get it if it's humanly possible." Complying with this urging, the young savage opened his mouth wide, pointed with his finger down his throat, then up at the sky, spread both hands abroad in a vague manner, and exclaimed, "Ho!" as though to say, "That's crystal clear, isn't it?" "Oh, for shame! Is that what you're trying to say, that you ate too much?" said Crummer. Obviously that was not what he wanted to say, for the poor savage looked around with a thoroughly disheartened expression. "Come here, Powlet," cried Bolverk. "You're a clever boy. See if you can clarify things." Powlet recognized his name when Bolverk beckoned him over. Bolverk introduced Powlet to a young savage, and instructed them to communicate through signs. Bolverk touched both of their lips and pushed their heads together. The young savage spoke to Powlet, who turned to Bolverk and moaned for a few seconds. Crummer asked if Powlet was in pain, but Leif speculated that the young savage and Powlet were discussing a wounded comrade who may be hidden in their village. Thorkel disagreed, saying they would have asked for him sooner. They all wished they knew what the savages were trying to convey. Suddenly a tall and serious-looking savage stepped forward, sat down, and began to howl and gesture wildly. The other savages nodded along and shouted, "Ho!" in agreement. Crummer was confused by their message, and suggested it was easy to say ho, but difficult to understand what they wanted. Halfgrimr stepped forward and sang a few notes of a song. The savages were overjoyed, and Crummer sang Danish Kings for them. After the song, one of the savages approached Halfgrimr and touched his lips. Crummer made a show of his disappointment, but they all knew the savages wanted a song from Halfgrimr. Halfgrimr was happy to comply with the savages' request. As he sang, their eyes were half closed, and their mouths were more than half open, heaving a deep sigh when he finished. The feast was pleasantly concluded, and in doing so they sealed their friendship. But the Norsemen had something even more satisfying in store. It was soon discovered that the savages possessed a large number of beautiful furs, which they were willing to part with for the merest trifle, in the form of brilliant cloth or an ornamental bauble. This not only allowed the Norsemen to procure valuable cargo for both their ships, but also created work that would prevent the natives from growing idle and engaging in forms of mischief that proverbially lie ready for idle hands. One evening shortly after the feast, while sitting in the chief hall polishing his iron headpiece, Leif suggested to his friends that they should send their ships to Greenland at the earliest convenience. He volunteered to oversee the loading of the ships when he got there. Bergunner, who was dandling Snorro on her knee, eagerly asked if she could accompany him, Leif agreed, but asked if Frigga had any objections. Frigga replied that she would be happy to get rid of her, and Halfgrimr, who was busy making a bow, simply resumed his work. Kjartan then asked if Leif would return and spend the winter with them, to which he replied with a smile that he couldn't promise. Snorro then asked if he could go to Greenland too. Leif agreed, and Ogmundr, who had just entered the hall, added that he should go with Snorro so that he wouldn't get lost in the woods. Bolverk then interjected that there were no woods in Greenland. Thorgunnar insisted that if Snorro left, she must go too, as he could not manage without her. Astrid suggested they all go together to Greenland. Bolverk agreed with her, but only half meant it. Kjartan noted that many of the men were homesick and suggested they call a thing to discuss the idea of leaving Vinland. Thorkel disagreed, pointing out that they had worked hard to settle there, and it would be a shame to give it all up unless absolutely necessary. He suggested calling a thing to discuss it in an orderly way. Kjartan agreed to this, but noted that discussing it here was not disorderly. They eventually agreed to call a thing the following day to decide whether or not to leave Vinland.